Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this evening. It's on communication skills, and we are very proud and pleased to have Dr. Martin Brunet with us, who is a GP partner and trainer. He works 6 sessions a week as a GP partner and trainer near Guildford in England. He was a GP program director on the Guildford GP specialty training scheme for 10 years before stepping back from that in 2019 to write his groundbreaking book, The GP Consultation Reimagined, A Tale of Two Houses. He regularly teaches on consultation and communication skills, and we are very pleased to have him with us here this evening. Martin also runs a full day course on communication and consultation skills with the MDU, and we have the course running in person in our London office in July and October this year. So we'll give you some details about that later in the presentation. So just a few housekeeping points to start with. We are going to be monitoring questions throughout. So whatever questions you have for Martin, please put them in the questions tab on the little grey and white dashboard on your screens. At the end of the webinar, when you leave, you will get a pop-up feedback survey, and please take some time to complete that for us. It really helps us to hear how you found things, what we could do that's better, any suggestions for upcoming webinars that you'd like to see us do. So if you take 2 minutes to do that, you will then get your certificate of attendance once you have completed it. And for any other questions or queries, if you have any technical difficulties, put them in the chat, and we have got 2 colleagues here who will monitor that this evening. Any questions about courses, email courses@themdu.com. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Martin Brunet and let him do his thing.
Thank you very much, Claire. Fantastic to be with you all this evening. So I'm going to talk about pinch points in the communication and how to navigate them, how to navigate some of the tricky bits, the sticking points when consultations, whether in primary or secondary care, can go a bit wrong with the communication. As Claire said, I'm an active GP working 6 sessions. I'm a trainer. I'm also on Instagram. I'll mention a bit more about that later. And I have no links with industry. The book that I published was published in June 2020, which was a very interesting time to publish on the consultation because everything had been totally turned on its head by lockdown. And I hesitate to call it a model for the consultation, but I do call it the 2 houses model. What I don't want anyone to think is that they should follow the 2 houses model when they consult. But what I do hope is that you might find things from this model that you incorporate into your own consultation model. I say to my trainees, I've got a new trainee called Nicole, and I say to her, Nicole, you're developing the Nicole model for consulting, but hopefully you'll steal some things from me, some ideas from me that you'll put in your toolbox, your consultation model as you develop it. And I hope that all of you attending here will come away with something that you think, I think I'm going to put that into my own personalized model, my own way of communicating. That'll be helpful for me. One of the things that really shaped my whole way of thinking about the consultation was ICE, ideas, concerns and expectations. This idea we should find out what the patient thinks. It was a real revelation to me. I did about 5 years in hospital medicine. I was a medical registrar for a while. And although I think I was a fairly compassionate doctor, I liked talking to people, it had never occurred to me to ask the patient what they were thinking because I wasn't taught that way in medical school. People are taught that a lot better now in medical school. But what's it like in practice? And just have a little moment yourself to think, what's it like for you in practice? When you do try to find out what the patient's thinking, how does it work? Does it work really well? Do you know when to do it? Do you sometimes fall flat on your face because you try and do it and it doesn't really work? Do you forget to do it? Do you not bother to do it? Is it something you've never heard of before? For me, it was very formative when I was teaching ICE, finding trainees sometimes not doing it as well as I thought they ought to, finding in my own practice I didn't always do it as well as I thought I ought to, and then trying to teach it harder. And then I read a paper that really skittled me initially. It really made me think maybe we're doing this whole thing wrong. I don't think we are, but it really shaped my thinking, which is what eventually led to writing the book. And it was this paper. It's called I Never Asked to Be Iced. The whole paper's on the screen. I love papers that short. And it was written by Rosamund Snow, who was the patient editor for the BMJ at the time. And she was talking to a friend, and the friend said, "Don't you hate it when they ask you what you think's wrong? I always tempted to say, why don't you know? You're the bloody doctor." And we've often, if you've tried ICE, you've often found that happens. You ask, what do you think? And the patient looks at you as if, you know, you're not competent, you don't know what you think, and you're hoping they're going to help you out. Rosamond and her friends all found that they'd had this rather unsettling experience. And then she chatted to a GP friend who said, you've been iced. And Rosamond thought, well, I never asked to be iced. And talking to her GP friend, Rosamond could see it was done with the best of intentions. And yet it still felt like putting her on the spot. It didn't quite feel right. Then she said this: "A little while later, I saw a doctor who I felt had gold standard communication skills. Afterwards, I thought about what she'd done to make me feel so able to talk to her. Instead of probing my feelings with ICE-based questions, her primary focus was answering the questions I'd asked, so I felt she was listening, and key, we were working together. If she needed information I'd not yet volunteered, she made clear why she was asking each question. She shared her thoughts as we went along, which is a really good skill, so we could discuss them rather than putting me on the spot. And this is the crunch. That made it much easier for me to share my thoughts and worries with her too." And that is a doctor who somehow achieved the goal of ICE, but did it in such a natural way that Rosamond didn't even notice. She just created the environment that Rosamond wanted to share her thoughts and her worries with this doctor, and it was very effective. So what are some of the challenges maybe with how we've been taught to do ICE in medical school, how I was teaching my trainees to do it? Where can it go wrong? Well, these are some of my thoughts about where it can go wrong. One is, it can feel like you're quizzing the patient. It takes me back to being around the hospital bed and the consultant saying, "What do you think's the diagnosis?" when I was a medical student. And that's terrifying. You've got this, you know, this expert asking you as the layperson what you think's going on. And patients can feel very threatened by that. We certainly don't want to be quizzing them. Sometimes it can just seem too obvious. You say, you know, pus on your throat, fever, what do you think it might be? Well, tonsillitis, duh. We don't want to ask stupid questions. Now, we can refine that. We can say the obvious question is this tonsillitis? Would antibiotics help? Do you have any other questions? But we certainly don't want to ask stupid questions. Sometimes it can become very formulaic, and trainees often, when they're learning this to start with, will go, what are your ideas? What are your concerns? What are your expectations? And obviously, that's not the way we want it to be. Another is sometimes the patient just genuinely doesn't know what they think. They've got an idea that something's wrong, but they don't know what the diagnosis is. They've got a bit of a worry it could be serious, but there's no specific diagnosis they're worried about. They've got an expectation you might do something, but they've no idea what the treatments might be. So they are allowed to not know what they think. And they're also allowed to keep their cards close to their chest if they want to, because sometimes a patient won't want to tell you what they're thinking straight away. You might ask early on, you know, did you have any thoughts what we might do about this? Maybe someone's come about back pain and they're thinking physio. The trouble is, if they say at that point physio, you might just go, yeah, physio, off you go, next patient, please. And maybe you had a better offer. And maybe they want to wait and hold that physio card. And if you don't mention physio, they'll come up with it. But they may come up with it very late because they didn't want to play that card early. And that's because people, you know, we're not algorithms or robots. We do play games when we communicate, not because we're trying to be manipulative. That's just how humans communicate. It's perfectly okay for them to want to hold that back. And yet, we do need to understand each other, because if we assume that we know what the patient's thinking, we can really go on the wrong foot. I remember seeing a woman once who had a spot on her leg. It was a spot. There was no way it was anything more than a spot. And I did happen to say, was there anything she was worried? And she was worried it might be a deep vein thrombosis, a DVT. Now, as a doctor, I'd have never considered that. And yet, knowing that she thought it might be that meant, you know, I was able to show that her calf wasn't swollen and explain to her why it wasn't a DVT, and that was very helpful. So patients can be quite left field and think of unusual things that as doctors and healthcare professionals will never expect them to be thinking of, and somehow we need to find that out. And one of the key things that this made me think about in GP is ICE has often been taught as a task. We should do ICE. When do we do it? How do we do it? And yet actually doing it as a task maybe isn't the best way to think about it. Maybe the best way to think about how we consult in both primary and secondary care is that we want to get real objectives, goals of what we want to achieve. And it doesn't matter what tools or skills we use to get there. The question is, can we get there? And in the consultation, I think we can boil every single consultation, it's a bit of a bold claim, down to 2 key objectives. If we can work out what matters to the patient in front of us and to the doctor, and then bring those together and decide together what we're going to do about it, then we've nailed it. Doesn't matter whether someone's come with an infected fingernail or depression or shoulder pain, or maybe even they're having a heart attack. I've had that twice in my room. What mattered there was the patient just said, get me better, I'll do whatever you want. And I took over. But it's still actually working out what matters to the patient. I worked out they were having a heart attack, and together we decided what to do. The patient let me lead. So I think every consultation can be broken down to those 2 objectives. And in the 2 houses model, I basically used 2 metaphors, the imagery of 2 houses, to help us understand what are the challenges with achieving those key objectives, what are the skills we can use in order to do them really well. Where we work out what matters, I call the house of discovery. Where we decide together what to do, I call the house of decision. The house of discovery is analogous to exploring the patient's own home. It's like we're on their turf. We're very much in their lived experience. We've got to be working out what matters with their health beliefs, which might be very different to ours, with their priorities, and we've got to be willing to go into their world a bit. The house of decision, on the other hand, is analogous to being like an expert tour guide taking someone around a house. So you can imagine that all the rooms in this house contain plans that we can do, actions we can take, decisions we can make. So say someone comes with shoulder pain, there's going to be a room marked painkillers, there's going to be another room marked injections, refer to secondary care, arrange an x-ray, a scan, do an operation. And the key thing is to help the patient get to the right room. This is our patch. We understand this house. We understand everything that's going on in it. We have the technical knowledge to know how to navigate it. But we've got to work out what matters to the patient to know where to go. And what we find out in the first house directs what happens in the second. So in the first house, we ask a question like, have you wanted to take painkillers? And they say, oh, I'm not a pill popper. I just want to know what's going on. We can ignore the painkiller room in the second house. On the other hand, if they say, yeah, and they're not even touching the sides, I need something stronger, we know that we've got to go and visit that room when we get to the second house. Now, I'm not going to take you through the entire 2 houses model, because we don't have time for that. You need to read the book if you want to go through the whole thing. But I'm going to pick some things out from that I think might be helpful for you tonight. One question, I'm aware that some people here may well be in secondary care or medical students who haven't decided their direction. What does this mean for secondary care? In a sense, the hospital clerking is a fairly rigid structure, but there's an awful lot of more communication that goes on in secondary care. Yes, secondary care is more likely to be doctor-led, but if you get the communication wrong in secondary care, you get as many complaints as problems as we do in primary care. And clerking is only a small part of talking to patients. Seeing them for follow-up, seeing them on ward rounds is much more like primary care in terms of the way the conversation goes. So thinking about them as houses, one question is, how do you feel when someone visits your own home? And just take a moment to imagine that. If someone comes to visit your house, maybe they're coming for dinner, how do you feel when they arrive? Does it matter if they're unannounced? Maybe then it's not tidy. Maybe you want to tidy up. Maybe there's a sense of vulnerability when someone comes. It might depend on how well you know them. Your best friend, you might not mind how messy your house is. Whereas, that slightly awkward relative, you want everything to be perfect. Maybe we feel different about different parts of our house. So someone's fine coming into the lounge and the kitchen, but we don't want them going up into our bedroom. Now, when we imagine a little bit about how we feel about our own home, the vulnerabilities, is someone going to mess up our house because they might not take their shoes off, all those sorts of thoughts, it gives us a bit of an idea of how a patient might feel when we visit their house of discovery. It reminds us that they know their house better than we do, but they might well be feeling vulnerable. They might be worried that we're going to judge them or that we're going to mess up their house, the equivalent of not taking our shoes off. Doctors do mess up patients' lives. We give them bad news, or we tell them that they should change, drink less, stop smoking. We can cause them problems and they can feel very vulnerable about that. It reminds us that we treat different parts of the house differently. If we're going to go the equivalent of going up into the bedroom, we need special permission. And there are parts of someone's life that we really need special permission. If we're going to ask about whether they're being abused or whether or not they're using drugs or other issues of embarrassment and shame, we treat them very differently. And in the book, I talk about exploring the basement, where people put things that they're ashamed of and don't want us to know about. So that's just a little bit about the house. But these are the pinch points I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about overloading the patient. I'm going to talk about the house of decision being a house of two wings. I'm going to talk about custard. I'm going to talk about the word need, and I'm going to talk about the consultation dance. So let's get into those. When we're doing this, one principle I really like to imagine with the consultation and communication is that we're building up a toolbox of tools that we use again and again when we're communicating, when we're consulting. And I literally imagine my consultation toolbox as being down by my side and getting out the equivalent of spanners and screwdrivers as I use communication skills. In other words, it's a very deliberate thing. I know what's in my toolbox. So in the book, I have a lot of boxes like this that basically talk about the principles and tools to apply when in relation to what I'm discussing in that chapter. And some tools, I really encourage my trainees to use new tools. So I'll often start a consultation in silence. I'll get the patient from the waiting room. It's a new problem. I'll tell them who I am, and I just sit down and look expectant. And they don't need me to say, how can I help you today? They're just on their way. I need a different tool when I've got a review appointment. You know, if I saw you last week for depression and I'm seeing you again today and I sit down in silence, you're going to look like I've forgotten who on earth you are. So I need to say, how's your week been? And I'm constantly refining my tools. So there's one tool that I've changed only in the last year or two. If someone comes with musculoskeletal pain and you want to know if they're taking painkillers, we'd often say, have you taken painkillers? It's an obvious tool to use. And yet the problem with have you taken painkillers for that question is it can be a bit accusatory. It's like, have you taken painkillers? Have you bothered? Have you tried before you came to see me? And I don't want to give that impression. So now I say, have you wanted to take painkillers? So it's a slight tweak. It now makes that tool feel more comfortable in my hands because the patient can say, oh no, I'm not a pill popper. But they can also say, yeah, and they're not working. I need something stronger. It's a much more open question. It's not accusatory. So I'd really encourage you with all the ways you communicate to be very intentional in the words you use, the phrases you use, and build up really good tools in your toolbox. Some you'll get out 20 times a day. Some are down, hidden in the bottom of your toolbox. You know they're there, but you rarely need them. There's one I used for the first time in a couple of years recently where I said, I'm feeling quite frustrated here. Is that how you're feeling? I'm not going to get that one out very often, but I know it's there if I need it. And it's a matter of really just being intentional. I do think when we're communicating with patients, we're almost like actors. We're doing communication things in order to help, in order to improve the quality of that interaction. We're not just chatting naturally like we would with a friend down the pub. So first pinch point, the communication dance. So I like to see the way the interaction between the doctor and the patient a bit like a dance, and not just any old dance, but a dance on Strictly. So on Strictly, you have the professional dancer. They know all the dance moves. They know their foxtrot and their rumba. They know the pattern of the dance. They're familiar with the costumes. They know how big the dance floor is. They know the rules of what you can do in dances. Then they have a celebrity who may be someone with a background in performing arts, and they might be quite good at dancing, or they may not have moved their body to music for 30 years. The key thing is the expert has to get the celebrity to dance as well as they can. It's no good the professional doing fabulous pirouettes if the celebrity has stopped moving, or if they're not in step, they're not going to get a good score. So we're the professional dancer. Our dance floor, if you like, is our consulting room or our hospital where we work, where we operate. Our knowledge of the dance is our expertise, our ability to understand medicine, to interpret tests, to be able to do the practical skills that we do as a doctor. And the patient with us may also be a healthcare professional. Maybe they're also an expert and they understand this dance quite well. Maybe they're a real expert in their condition. They might even know more about their condition than we do. Or maybe they haven't been to the doctor in 20 years and they hate coming to see the doctor, or their health literacy and health understanding is very limited. The key thing is it's not about what a brilliant doctor we are if we leave the patient behind. We've got to take them with us. We've got to get them dancing as well as we possibly can. So the question is, how do we keep the dance going? So here are some thoughts about how to keep that dance going throughout the communication. The first one is being right is half the issue, but it's only half the issue. So we do need to be medically competent. You know, it's no good being a brilliant communicator if you're medically inept. But equally, it's no good being fantastically correct with your guidelines and your knowledge if you can't bring the patient with you and they ignore all your suggestions and don't follow up with the plan, or just make a complaint because they didn't like how you treated them. So we need to be right, but it's only half the issue. The second is to be alert to cues that we're drifting apart from the patient. So we're very used to patients giving psychosocial cues. So where they say, is this because I'm a bit stressed, doctor? And that's very familiar to us. But patients drop a lot of communication skills, cues. So it might be that they're just looking a bit closed with their body language. It might be that they're getting grumpy or even angry. That's a pretty obvious cue that we're drifting apart in this dance. It might be that they're rejecting everything that we suggest. It might be that they repeat themselves. And when I spotted this when I was in public, if you're ever out and about in a shop and watching someone with a shopkeeper, just observe the communication, because it's very fascinating what you learn from that. I was in a jeweler's, and this older man, I wouldn't say he was angry, but he was definitely a bit agitated. And he was agitated because they'd had his watch for 6 weeks and to repair it, and it had exactly the same fault when he got it back. And he said it's losing 5 minutes an hour. And the woman said, have you got your receipt for the repair? And a little bit later he said, I wouldn't mind if it was losing 5 minutes a day, but it's losing 5 minutes an hour. And she tapped on her computer. And a third time he said, it's losing 5 minutes an hour. And she said, we'll send it off, it'll be about 2 weeks. Now, on the one hand, that was a successful consultation because he got what he wanted. He wanted them to repair it. And if they repair it successfully, it'll be fine. But if they don't, I think next time he'll be angry because he didn't feel listened to. I don't know if she heard. If she did hear, she gave him no cue that she'd heard. She could have just laughed. I mean, she never said, I'm sorry, it's not been fixed. She could have said, gosh, 5 minutes an hour, I can see why that bothers you. I mean, that's not a watch, that's a bracelet. It's of no use to anyone. But she didn't acknowledge it, and so he kept repeating it. And sometimes our patients repeat themselves. You know, they might say, yeah, but I can't carry on like this, doctor, or I really can't live with this pain, or, you know, I need to do something. I've got to get back to work. Now, it may be we can't fix the thing they're saying, but we can at least acknowledge that we've listened. And if someone's repeating themselves, maybe they just haven't felt that we've heard, and we need to signal we've heard before we can move on. Another thing, and this is really important, the more we might disagree, the more important it is to agree. Now, this one sounds a bit odd. I'm not saying agree with everything the patient says, lie down and do everything they want you to do. What I am saying is that quite often we get a cue that we might have a disagreement down the line. Patient might start the consultation with, I won't keep you long, doctor, I just need you to arrange a scan for me. And we might immediately think, I'm not sure scans, I may well disagree with them, maybe a scan isn't what they need. It's a bit like we can see a tricky bit in the dance. So coming down the line, we know there's some really tricky steps. Well, if we're going to get through that disagreement where I'm going to have to say, I don't think a scan is going to be the way forward, then the more we're dancing well before we get there, the better. Whereas if we're drifting before we get there, we're almost certainly going to trip when we get to the tricky bit. So finding common ground, finding agreement is a really good thing to do in communication with patients, and it's even more important when we might be disagreeing with them. So someone comes and they want an MRI scan for their back. Well, I can at least agree that it's reasonable to ask if an MRI scan is going to help. I can agree that it's not pleasant being in pain. I can agree that we want to try and solve this problem. And then having felt listened to, having found all that common ground, maybe when I say, probably as I think getting an MRI scan might be a waste of your time, they might then be listening to me, and they might then be much more open to actually some physiotherapy would be more helpful. Whereas if we've had a bit of a lack of connection, and then I say, you know, you can't have an MRI scan, or even if I use the same words, I think it'd be a waste of your time. If they've not connected with me before, we're probably going to go wrong. So the more we might disagree, the more important it is to find that common ground and find agreement wherever we can. Then use your dancing skills to build rapport and check in regularly. I imagine it's a bit like the lead dancer often has that hand on the shoulder of the other dancer, and a little bit of pressure this way or that way tells us which way we're going. And these are some of the skills we can use. One, and if there's nothing else you add to your toolbox, if this isn't in your toolbox, I'd really say get it in there. when we come up with a problem, with a management plan, a suggestion, it's very natural to say, is that okay? And yet, all the patient can say when we say, is that okay, is yes or no. Now, if they say yes, that's fine, but maybe they didn't have the courage to say no, because it's quite hard to say to a doctor, no, that's not okay. On the other hand, if we say, how does that sound? Then they can't just say yes or no. They either have to say, yeah, that sounds really good, I'm happy with that. In which case, we really know they're happy with it. We get a pat on the back and we feel like, yeah, I've done a good job there. And that's a good thing, makes us feel better. But it also means that they can quite easily say, well, I'm not quite sure, do I really need to start that blood pressure tablet? Could I maybe try and lose some weight first or something like that? So there's much, how does that sound? How do you feel about that? Is a great way of checking the plan with the patient rather than just, is that okay? Another one is to explore what they think. So before we create the plan, we might say, well, what do you think about statins? How would you feel about using tablets for your blood pressure? You know, what are your thoughts on surgery for this knee problem? So we haven't built the plan yet. We're finding out what they think. We're working together before we decide what we're going to do. Maybe if one of the key goals is to find out what matters to someone, we should just go out and ask, what is it that matters to you? Rather than, what are your ideas, concerns, and expectations, which are maybe a little narrow. There's still good questions to ask, but maybe we just say, what is it that's important to you? What matters to you most? And then this is another one, which is, I think, particularly for primary care, but I think it can be good in clinics and things as well, is to share your thinking as you go along. In secondary care, where most of us did our training, it's quite correct to take a full medical clerking and do a full examination and then do some investigations and then put it all together before you come up with a plan with the patient. In primary care and maybe in clinics, we're much more likely to share thinking as we make the plan up. So I might be saying something like, I'm wondering whether we might need to arrange a scan here, or I'm just want to check out whether this chest pain might be from your heart. I need to just be sure about that. Or I might say, it's actually quite hard to be sure what's going on here. So, you know, we might just watch and wait, but at some point we're going to want to do some tests if this doesn't get better. How do you feel about that? And it can feel when you start in primary care that that's not really competent. A competent doctor just knows what to do and tells the patient what to do. But actually, a really competent, confident doctor is confident enough to let the patient into the plan. The patient's often a little bit random and it can feel a bit scary to let the patient in the plan, but I think we make much better plans if we share our thinking as we go along. That was what Rosamund Snow said in her article. She shared her thinking as we went along, which allowed me to share my thoughts and worries too. I don't think we can ever make a plan up if we don't know what the patient's thinking, how they feel about it. So that's the first pinch point, the dance. The next one is need is what I call a power word, and we should handle it with care. Now, in the two houses model, I call this an empty room. This is where we're in the house of decision in this bit. And in the house of decision, although I've said the rooms contain different things with different problems, so if it's shoulder pain, you've got scans and injections and surgery and painkillers. If it's depression, you've got medication and counselling and chatting and other things that we might do for depression. My explanation of depression, what's going on. The contents are different, but in the book I talk about 6 different types of room that we come across. The high-tech room, optional rooms, empty rooms, locked rooms, hidden rooms, and room 101. And in this presentation, I'm going to cover 3 of those, and this one is about the empty room. So an empty room is where the patient thinks there's something valuable in this room. They think that's where the solution is, and we know it's empty. So the classic example is the patient wants antibiotics for their cough, and we know it's a viral cough, and the antibiotics aren't going to help. And it's very tempting to say, you don't need antibiotics. And the problem with you don't need is it's like standing at the door to this room marked antibiotics and saying you can't go in, you don't need to go in there. And what the patient hears is you don't deserve it, someone else deserves it more. Far, far better with an empty room is to open the door, go there straight away and show them how empty it is. So you say something like, the problem with antibiotics is I don't think they'll make any difference to your cough. That's very different. It's not about whether or not you need it or deserve it or whether someone deserves it more. It's just about the fact that it's empty. It's not going to help you at all. And then, having seen how empty that is, I might then be able to say, but I think an inhaler might make a difference, or I think it is viral. Look, this is what I'm expecting to happen, and give you a bit of advice about it. But we stop fighting. Whereas when you say, whenever you tell the patient that they don't need something that they think they still do need, you generally end up with a big fight where they try and show how much they really do deserve this prize, the antibiotics or the scan or whatever it is. Now, you can use the word need when you're trying to help someone, when you're explaining something that the patient doesn't want or doesn't think they need. So you might say an MRI scan is only helpful if we think you need an operation. They go, oh, I don't need an operation. Or I'm glad to say we don't need to do a colonoscopy. Most people would be quite relieved about that. So it's not that need is a problem on its own, but if you tell a patient they don't need something that they still think they do need, you can expect an argument. Show them how empty that room is. The next pinch point is to think about the house of decision as a house with two wings. So generally, all the actions that we take either increase the patient's understanding. So this would be my explanation of the problem. Tests I could arrange, like blood tests or scans. Watch and wait, diagnostic test of time, that can increase your understanding. Referral to a specialist. All of those can help increase understanding. Trial of treatment. Others are finding a solution. So things like antibiotics or antidepressants or painkillers or surgery, physiotherapy, all of those are going to help find a solution. And the key thing is to work out which wing or wings the patient wants to be in and make sure that we're in the same one. So say the patient has got chest pain and I say, I'm glad to say this is costochondritis, it's an inflammatory problem from your rib cage, nothing to do with your heart, you don't need to worry about it. And the patient then says, yeah, but what are you going to do about my pain, doctor? So here I was giving them increased understanding and had missed the fact that they wanted a solution. Or it might be, I'll say, it's costochondritis, it's an inflammatory problem, so I'd like you to take ibuprofen 3 times a day for the next 2 weeks and that should sort it out. And they go, oh, I'm not a pill popper. As long as it's not my heart, I can live with the pain. So here they just wanted better understanding and I was foisting a solution on them. So a really good question to ask yourself is, which wing or wings do they want to be in? Generally, they're always going to want to visit the increased understanding wing, at least to some extent. But do they want a solution? And when trainees come and ask me for advice, one question I'll often say to them is, do they want a solution? The next room we're going to talk about, or the next pinch point, is the high-tech room. So the high-tech room is where we explain stuff. And it can feel to a patient a bit like this room with lots of flashing lights and screens and beeping noises. It's full of jargon and technical explanation, and it's challenging to navigate this one. This is one we're going to navigate in pretty much every time we speak to a patient. In every consultation, in primary and secondary care, we have to explain stuff. And it's very challenging. How do we navigate the high-tech room without overloading the patient? We can almost imagine every time we give them a new piece of information, we're giving them a box to carry. And we can end up with them piled up with boxes. And no doubt, no great surprise that they will drop a lot of them on their way out. And the more hard to explain, the more difficult it is for them to carry those boxes. I always see the high-tech room as a place where ideally we're transferring power to the patient. So if I use lots of jargon and sound very clever, I keep the power for myself. If when I use jargon, I explain it in a way the patient can understand, I don't give them too much information, but I make it relevant to them, then I'm passing power to them. And that's the goal of the high-tech room. Now, these are some of the challenges, particularly with how we use language in the high-tech room. So we've got to be careful with jargon. But I think it really helps to get an understanding of how words work in medicine and how words work out in the normal world. So for instance, when someone has a migraine, patients will often say they've got a migraine, but they don't always mean a classical migraine like a doctor might mean. Sometimes when they say, oh, I had a migraine, they mean a severe headache. When a patient says they've got a chronic headache, do they really mean a chronic headache as in a long-lasting headache, like a headache over a long period of time, like a doctor would mean? Or do they mean it was chronic? They might say it was really chronic. They're probably describing an acute, severe headache. I remember at medical school, the words acute and chronic mystified me for quite a long time. I had no reference point. Acute was a word in geometry. Chronic didn't mean anything. And it took me a long time to understand what on earth my lecturers were talking about. So we have to be careful with words like that. We have to be careful with some of our language that we're so familiar with, we don't even realize how weird it is. So for instance, a friend of mine was doing a diabetes clinic, and he said to the patient, do you get any hypos? And the patient said, oh, no, I don't get any hypos. But I get these terrible lopos on the golf course, and I have to have something to eat to recover. Because why on earth is a hypo actually a lopo? You know, we have the Greeks to thank for that, but our word for low sounds like the English for high. And we're so inoculated to that, we don't even realize it. And then we've got to be careful about some of the language that we've developed as a medical profession and we're a bit stuck with. I have a real bee in my bonnet about blood thinners. So everyone calls them blood thinners these days. Patients know what we mean about blood thinners. But I'm really interested in not only what does a word mean, but how does it make someone feel? So how would you feel if I said, I'm going to give you a pill to thin your blood? Just for the minute, imagine as a patient how you'd feel about that. Get yourself out of your medical mind. Because the idea of thin blood, it doesn't sound great, it doesn't feel great. It feels and sounds a bit weak and a bit watery. Blood is meant to be rich and warm and nutritious, and we're going to thin it. Now, because of the way it makes you feel, I've had a number of patients, I get one probably every 6-12 months, that will say to me, I get really cold because of these blood thinners. Or is my tiredness because of the blood thinners? Because it's a natural connection for them to make. And what really irritates me is they don't even thin the blood. It's not technically correct. Your blood's no thinner going around, it's just less sticky. So I have to use the word blood thinners because otherwise the patient will find out I've put them on blood thinners when they tell someone what they're on. So I'll often say they tend to be called blood thinners, but I don't like the word because they don't thin your blood. They just make it less sticky. And I think the idea of not having sticky blood is much more, I can get on with that a lot better. One of the key things as well, when you imagine those boxes, the more we can make the boxes of information we give the patient memorable and easy to understand, the better, and the more likely they are to carry them out of our waiting room and remain understanding them. And humans are very visual. If we give someone a visual analogy, they're much more likely to go away with it and remember it. So build a repertoire of visual explanations or simple ideas, simple ways of saying things so that you just use them again and again and again. So here are some of my visual explanations that I like using. I like talking about burnouts like a stress fracture. I'll say, if you go on a 50-mile march, you might end up with a fractured foot. And it's not because you fell over, it's the continual pounding that causes that fracture, so that after the march, you realize you can't even walk. Well, for you, the continual pounding has meant that one day you woke up and it was like there was a fracture. You couldn't face going to work. You couldn't face your emails. You had a panic attack. I like vertigo is like shaking a snow globe. So this is for benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, where you have crystals in your inner ear. And I'll say to someone, it's a bit like one of those snow globes. When you shake it, all the crystals flurry up, but once they've settled, you're fine again. Patients really get that, and it helps them understand why their symptoms are so bizarre when the snowflakes or the crystals are flurrying, but absolutely fine in between. I like this one. I've stolen this one from a chap called Tim Cantifer, who wrote a great book, Depressive Illness, The Curse of the Strong. And this is, depression is like a bath. And at the moment, the tap's running, but the plug's out and all the water's drained away. Well, that is really how someone feels, so they understand that. And then if we're going to talk about an antidepressant, I'll say taking an antidepressant is like putting the plug in. But this bath is going to take 2 to 6 weeks to fill up. And I don't even need to explain that at 2 weeks, the water's just sort of getting to above their toes, and at 4 weeks might be at their knees. They can just see that with the image, they can grasp it, and people really like that. It really helps them understand it. I like explaining risk with your hands. So rather than using numbers with many patients, I'll say, if your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke is this big, and by taking a statin every day, we can make it this big, you're probably interested. Whereas if it's this big and by taking the same tablet every day, you can make it that big, you're probably not. So let's look at your risk. I like just simple words. I'll often say with irritable bowel syndrome, the bowel isn't diseased, but it misbehaves. And that helps them understand why all their tests are normal, but they do still have a problem, this misbehaving bowel. I like the imagery of a stress barometer. It sounds like your migraines, your IBS, your eczema is your stress barometer. I mentioned Instagram before. I've got quite into doing videos on mental health on Instagram. And on Instagram, it's a real discipline, because you have to do a video that lasts no more than 90 seconds. And it really means you've got to be succinct with getting your point across, which is also what we want to do in the consultation, so we don't give people too much information. And I like using quite a lot of visual props when I do my videos. So if you're interested in mental health and getting mental health ideas into your toolbox and visual analogies, then you might want to take a look at that. For some of the websites, I'll put QR codes, so you should be able to get that on your phone if you are interested. The fifth pinch point is Room 101. I named this after George Orwell's novel 1984, where the totalitarian state, if they want to really put you under pressure, put you in Room 101, because it contains your greatest fear. And Room 101 is all about Oobleck. If you don't know what Oobleck is, it's named after Dr. Seuss' book, Bartholomew and the Oobleck, where there's this green sticky stuff in the land. And Oobleck is a white or yellow sticky stuff. You're most likely to come across it if you ever make your own custard, because if you get custard powder and you mix it with a little bit of water or milk, then it forms this substance Oobleck. Oobleck is what's known as a non-Newtonian fluid. So Newtonian fluids like oil and water, they change their viscosity when you change the temperature. Heat up oil, it gets runnier, cool it down, it gets thicker. Oobleck changes its viscosity with other forces applied. So when it's not under pressure, it's a liquid, it's runny and very fluid. But when you put it under pressure, and you can make Oobleck in a bowl and punch it, when you put it under pressure, it massively increases its viscosity and it becomes like a solid. You can pick it up and roll it in your hands and it's like a putty, but as soon as you stop, it turns back to liquid. And this picture of these people are running on a swimming pool made of Oobleck. As long as they keep running, then it will be a solid and they'll get to the other side. But if they stop, then they're going to sink because it turns into a liquid. Why on earth am I talking about Oobleck? I used to teach about Oobleck on the Guildford VTS, talking about motivational interviewing, because one of the key principles of motivational interviewing, this is trying to help someone change their behavior, stop smoking, drink less, exercise more, is to roll with resistance. You know, if you say you need to stop smoking and they say it's my only vice, doctor, the more you push, the more they'll resist. So you're better to roll with it. In the two houses model, we meet resistance sometimes, and it's a really important room to go in, and that's why I call it Room 101. So this is a room that contains an action that really the patient needs to do, but they're scared to go in there or they're resistant to go in there. So this would be something like hospital admission for sepsis, or steroids for asthma, or steroids for temporal arteritis, or emergency surgery. And the patient, if the patient doesn't resist it, it's just the right treatment, you get on with it. But when the patient goes, oh, I can't possibly take steroids, or no, I can't stay in hospital, or I'm not going to hospital, we've met at Room 101. We can't just say, oh, that's fine then, don't worry, because you know, if they don't take steroids for their giant cell arteritis, they might be blind tomorrow. It's really important they go in this room, if at all possible. And the key principle when we meet Room 101 is when we encounter resistance, stop pushing and start listening. So rather than just say, but you really must take steroids, it's really important you take steroids, back off and say, let's find common ground. You're right, steroids are a big deal, we shouldn't take them lightly. So this is where I go back to that, the more you might disagree, the more you need to agree. So we're now disagreeing about the fact that you should have steroids, because I really think you need to have steroids, your asthma is very severe, but you don't want to have them. So I'm backing off and I'm going to try and build some common ground. You're right, steroids are a big deal. Tell me what you think about steroids. So I'm understanding that. Maybe they'll tell me that their granny was on them for years for her rheumatoid and her body fell apart. And I can then say, you're absolutely right, that is a problem, but we're talking about 5 days and that's a very different issue. Maybe there's an even scarier Room 101 next door, hospital admission. And I might say, my worry is if you don't have the steroids, you might end up getting worse and end up in hospital. And actually they're more scared of that, and it helps them to go into the room with the steroids and to take the steroids. Sometimes we need to play the long game. Maybe someone's not ready for something now, and we have to do the next least bad option. You know, maybe we'll say, look, I am really worried about you not going to hospital tonight. You could get really sick, you might even die, but I respect why you don't want to go in. We could do some antibiotics and I'll give you a ring in the morning, that sort of thing. Because if they're a competent adult, obviously they can say, I'm not going in that room. So those are the 5 pinch points. Just a couple of resources to mention to you as we're finishing. One is I I've set up a website. If anyone's got trainees, GP trainees sitting the SCA exam, I do some SCA courses, something called GP Toolbox. But I've also got an Instagram page where I post communication consultation skill videos about every couple of weeks or so. So if you're interested in picking up more tips, you might want to go and look at my GP Toolbox Instagram. And obviously the biggest resource that goes with this talk, apart from the MDU's course, which I'm looking forward to being on, is the book. If anyone's interested in buying the book on Amazon, it's $22.99, but you can get a discount. My publisher has given me a discount code, 2houses35, where you'll get 35% off. There's the QR code for their website. It's Cyan Publishing. So if you're interested, even paying a bit of postage, that's very much the cheapest way you can get it. Thank you very much for listening. So I'm going to go back to Claire now. I've also got a website, 2housesgp.com, by the way, where you can read some more and get in touch with me if you need. Claire, you wanted to mention the course.
Yes, just to highlight the fact. So this the course is a full day course in person in our London office, and it's going to offer a much more in-depth exploration of your consultation and communication skills. So the 2 dates are on the screen. Do have a think about it. It is equally well placed, I would say, Martin, and I hope you would agree, for primary and secondary care clinicians.
Yeah, the one when I'd done it before, the mix was exactly 50-50, the last one I did, and that's a lovely mix actually of primary and secondary care.
Because really, we can all learn things from one another. The last slide is just other webinars upcoming in case there are any that catch your eye, and the dates of those, just so if you fancy any of those, keep an eye on social media or go to the MDU website and have it booked, and it would be brilliant to see you all. So we're going to move on to some questions now. We've had loads of interesting questions. So I would just like to say personally that I have found the talk fascinating. I was also a GP trainer for some years before I joined the MDU, and I love the fact that you highlighted the fact that your model is not a set of rules, Martin, it's a set of tools. And that's a very different thing, and we take the tools that we want to change and improve our own consultation skills from that. It's not a rigid, you must do this. So I think it's you know, I can think of lots of consultations that I could go back and do slightly differently. So I'm going to just run through some of the questions. There are numerous along themes, so I have amalgamated some of these. The first is, when and how did you come up with this model? Was it one consultation that triggered it, somebody asked, or was it an evolution over many years?
Thank you. So it was definitely an evolution through teaching, because as a trainer and as a program director, you teach communication skills all the time, but mostly one-to-one in tutorials or in group sessions. And I started using some analogies. So the first one of the rooms is optional rooms, where basically we say to trainees, look, open the door and have a look. You know, don't go and spend ages talking about painkillers if the patient's not interested. So, you know, open the door, just say, are you interested in painkillers? And get them to visualize opening a door. So some of those evolved, and then I was asked by my GP tutor actually to do a talk on their GP update on communication skills. And it was the first time I had to do a 2-hour lecture, 2-hour actual talk, and had to kind of bring it all together. And that's where I thought, actually, this does all go together. And then I presented that to my trainer group, and they said, oh, you should write this down. So I stopped being a program director in order to write the book. So
excellent, and snowballed from there, obviously. Yeah. That's brilliant, thank you. The next question is, do you have any advice for car crash consultations? I'm presuming by this that the questioner means one that you watch go wrong in slow motion and you just can't fix it as you go along. So any advice, and we're not expecting 15 minutes in this, but are there ways that you can just think, this is going wrong, I need to do something here? What do you do?
I think sometimes to just say that with the patient and just say, I think I'm on the wrong track here, maybe we should start again, or maybe we're on the wrong foot a little bit here. So you might come out with it and just say, look, I don't think this is going quite well. Let's just step back a little bit. I don't think I'm quite getting where you're at. I would always try and imply the blame is with me. I don't think I've quite understood, because I can take that, and if I'm accusing the patient, even if it is their fault in my mind, it's not going to go down well to say, look, you're just making no sense to me, But you might also do it more subtly. So if it's going wrong a bit, ask yourself, can you find any common ground? So go back and say, yeah, you're absolutely right about this. I'm not saying I totally agree with you about this.
Yeah.
It's probably when it's car crash, there's something you're disagreeing with. So maybe you can reclaim some common ground and then go back and visit it.
Mm-hmm. I have one slightly technical issue. One of the attendees would like you to put the QR code up for your discount, Martin. Could you flick back to that slide first? Would you mind terribly, just so that obviously passed by. So the next question is about patients who come with a shopping list, and the delegate has described these consultations like a trip to Tesco's. So they often are so pressured to get through all of the things that they want to discuss that they can barely stop to listen to your reply to the first question before bouncing off to the next one. So I think the question is there a way of slowing people down and getting to what they actually want, rather than doing the full shopping list?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing is to look for those cues in their opening lines that there might be a list. Sometimes I'll just say I've got a list, or sometimes I'll say the main thing is, or I have a couple of things. And then what I try and do is get out the list in its entirety early on. So if there's clearly a few things, what they'll often tend to do is they'll say, well, I've got 3 things. Okay, and I'll say, well, tell me about them. And the first one will be back pain. And then they'll want to start going into the story of back pain. And I'll usually stop them and say, okay, so the first one's back pain. Tell me what the others are. Because then I can work out, their 3 things might be back pain. Oh, could you give me a repeat prescription? And I'm not sure when my blood test is due. Well, I can do 2 and 3 in a moment. So I then can do all 3. Or it might be it's back pain, depression. I remember a patient coming for a diabetes check. It was his full-on annual diabetes check. And he also said, I've been feeling really low recently. I'm not sleeping. I've been getting this chest pain on exertion, and I've got problems with my toes. And then what you have to do is set an agenda. When you've got all that list, you might think, yeah, I can do all 3, but very commonly you can't. And you might then, right at the beginning, say, look, those are all really important. So, value them all, agree with them that these are all important. You don't want to poo-poo any of them, and just say, but I think that's more than we can get through today. What's the one you want me to focus on today? Now, sometimes I'll say, like with my diabetes patient, I'll say, I think we need to focus on that chest pain because I think that's quite significant. But otherwise, if there's not one that's standing out for me medically, I'll say, what do you want me to focus on today? And then offer to have, however many appointments we need to follow up the others. So get it out early, set an agenda with them, and don't let them tell you all about each one in turn until you've set that agenda and agreed on it.
By then, half the consultation time has gone, and then you start to get pressured as well.
So you do each one in turn, and then find the last one was the most important.
Yeah, brilliant. So the next question, which will we go with? There's one that asks about patients that have an agenda which you cannot agree to. And what do you do about this? I'm not quite sure what by an agenda. I suppose they may come in with a fixed idea as to what they actually want, and anything less may not be acceptable to them. So I suppose you will be applying a lot of your tools to this type of consultation, Martin.
Yeah, so I think there are agendas that I could live with, but they want to fight me for, and then there are things that I can't live with at all. So sometimes someone comes in and they say, I won't keep you long. It always seems to start like that. I just need a scan for my back. And in the book, I call this popping the bubble, which is where I don't want to have a fight for the first 5 minutes about whether or not I'm going to deem them worthy of a scan. So I'll often say right at the beginning, sure, if a scan's going to be helpful, we can definitely do it. So the only if is if it's going to help you. And that pops the bubble. We're not going to now fight about a scan, and then they're more likely to be able to tell me about it. And then either I agree, yeah, I think you need a scan, or I might then be able to say, trouble is, I think a scan's going to be a waste of your time. But they felt we haven't been fighting over it. Now, sometimes you'll have a patient who's got an agenda that you can't agree with. I just need you to give me some methadone, or had a patient say, when I go down the gym and my friends give me testosterone, I perform better. I just need you to give me that. Well, I'm not going to say, sure, if it's going to help you, I'm going to give you that. So it's more tricky when it's something that you absolutely cannot agree with. And sometimes someone has a really fixed belief, sometimes even a delusional belief, and that's always going to be very challenging. I think you can still find as much common ground as you can, without patronizing someone. I can understand why this is a problem to you, and I'm concerned about this and want to help. And I'll sometimes say, but we have a problem, or the problem we have is, I think often if we use the word we, then it feels a bit more collaborative. Problem we have is, actually as a doctor, I can't prescribe you medical cannabis, if that's what they're wanting.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. We are out of time, and there are still really interesting questions that I want the answers to are being added to the chat. So we've got through as many as we could in the time allotted to us. So it just remains for me to thank you hugely, Dr. Martin Brunet, on behalf of the MDU, for giving up your time this evening and for a really interesting and informative talk. And I hope to see lots of you next time. Good night.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your really interesting questions and for coming.
Bye all. Bye.